So one of the things that you have to understand about competition and competitive rivalry is how interlinked it is with a firm's business level strategy. So strategy obviously is not only a function of how good the strategy is and how well we implement that strategy, but it's also a function of how well we anticipate what our competitors are going to do in response to our strategy. And then, of course, in return, how we respond to their response. It's kind of a cycle, right? So competitive rivalry affects all strategies. It affects everything from cost leadership to differentiation to focus strategies. It affects other types of strategies as well. It affects corporate strategy, which is what we'll talk about in Chapter 6. But it also it affects everything that the company does and that the company will have to do. But of course, the dominant influence is on business level strategy because that's really how we compete within our given product markets. Okay. So it's not just what we do and how well we do it, but it's also how well our competitors do and how they respond to what we do and how we respond to what they do and so on. So as you can see, it's really a circle. Okay. So strategy, it is obviously influenced by competition, and that competitive rivalry evolves from the pattern of actions and responses. So the more aggressively that you respond to a competitor's action, the more than likely, the more aggressively they're going to respond to your action. We don't live in a vacuum. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Remember Newton's third law, which is really a gross oversimplification. So in other words, there's this connectedness in the industry with your competitors. In fact, emerging models of stakeholder theory actually suggest that competitors are a stakeholder within your company. And if we take the definition of stakeholder literally, it's that mutual interdependent. So you can see how a competitor is a stakeholder in your business. Okay. So we have to be very good in implementing our strategy. We have to have an effective strategy. We have to implement it correctly. And then we have to anticipate what our competitors are going to do and how they're going to respond to what we do. Okay, so it's not just what I do, but it's really a very sophisticated game of chess that emerges over time. So this just shows you a model where competitor analysis, as described in Chapter 5, with market commonality and resource similarity, taken in with the drivers of competitive behavior, awareness, motivation, and ability, leads to competitive rivalry, which is, of course, the likelihood of attack or response, and that leads, of course, to the outcomes, market position, and then financial performance, whether we're a below average, average, or above average performer. But what you have to understand is those outcomes, again, lead us directly into this cycle. It truly is a loop. Another way of looking at this is what's known as the OODA loop. This isn't something you're going to be tested on, so don't worry too much about it, but it does bear mentioning. One of the best strategy books out there is by an author named Boyd. It's The Fighter Pilot. Was a fighter pilot in World War II, and it's The Art of War. So what Boyd said is that a fighter pilot has to observe his environment, okay, see what's going on around you. You have to orient yourselves within those surroundings, okay, so we observe what's going on around us, see where we fit in the larger puzzle, then we decide what we're going to do based upon our position within the industry or in the battlefield or within the sky. We decide what we're going to do, and then we take action. And of course, it's kind of definitely implied here, right, that action results in consequences. But once those consequences play out, what happens? Again, we're observing what's going on in the battlefield or on the sky. We're seeing where we are within that. We're deciding what we need to do, and then we're taking action. So it's this whole notion of a continuous process where you go through that observe, orient, decide, and act over and over and over again. And it's very much the same with strategic management. If you were a freshman in Foundations of Business and I came in and did a guest lecture for you in that Foundations class, one of the things that I use in there is just something that I like to say is that business is not rocket science. It actually is figuring out what works and what doesn't work, and figuring out what works and doing more of it, and figuring out what doesn't work and cutting it out. Don't do it anymore. So, I mean, that's pretty common sense, right? Now, where the rubber hits the road, figuring out what works and why it works is much more difficult than just throwing out a phrase, figure out what works and do more of it, figure out what doesn't work and do less of it, right? It's much more sophisticated than that, but you can see in Boyd's loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. They call it the OODA loop. Or you can see in this preceding slide with this model of competitive rivalry, how that really is a continuous process. Okay? More coming up. Thanks for tuning in.